In 1963, General Motors killed an engine. It was an aluminium V8 built for family sedans. It leaked oil, it scrapped so many castings the accountants lost patience, and Detroit walked away from it without a backward glance. 3 years later, that same discarded design, rebuilt by a car parts company from Melbourne, powered a 40-year-old Australian to the Formula One World Championship in a car with his own name on the nose. That has never happened before or since. No driver in the entire history of the sport has won the world title in a car bearing his own name, except the man in this story, and he did it with an engine America decided was rubbish. These are 10 facts about the 1966 Brabham BT19 and the Repco V8, and by the end of them you will understand why the cheapest engine on the grid beat every expensive one. Fact 1. America built it, then gave up on it. The engine at the heart of this story started life in 1961 as the General Motors 215, an aluminium V8 shared across the Buick Special and the Oldsmobile F85, the compact cars Detroit built for suburban driveways. Oldsmobile even called its version the Rocket, which tells you exactly how seriously anyone took it. On paper, the engine was brilliant, light years ahead of the cast-iron boat anchors American manufacturers normally bolted into their cars, an all-aluminium V8 in an era when aluminium was still exotic. In practice, it was a production nightmare. The castings were porous, which meant oil leaks, and the factory could not reliably detect a leaking block until it was as much as 95% finished, so the scrap rate was brutal. There were 3 years of cylinder liner trouble. Ordinary American antifreeze reacted with the aluminium and clogged radiators, which meant warranty claims from furious customers who had done nothing wrong. And just as the problems peaked, a new thin wall casting process made iron engines cheap again, so the clever aluminium V8 ended up costing more to build than the crude iron engine it was supposed to embarrass. General Motors built roughly 750,000 of them across 3 model years, and then cancelled the whole program after 1963. Not because the idea was bad, but because it was cheaper to stop. Remember that reasoning, because 2 different countries were about to make Detroit regret it. Fact 2. An Australian parts company bought the leftovers for £11 a block. Jack Brabham knew the 215 well from American racing circles, where hot rodders had already noticed how little the block weighed. And when Formula One announced that engine capacity would double for 1966, he saw what nobody in Detroit could. He did not go to Ferrari or Coventry Climax. He went to Repco, an Australian company that had been grinding, reconditioning and manufacturing replacement parts in Melbourne since 1922. Repco was not an exotic race engine builder. It was the firm that kept ordinary Australian cars on the road, piston rings and bearings and valve grinds, a business about as glamorous as a hardware shop, which was precisely why Brabham trusted them. A company that lives on reconditioning other people's engines knows more about why engines fail than the companies that design them, and 1966 was about to become a season decided entirely by failure. In April 1964, Repco set up a small, dedicated engines operation with Brabham in Richmond, Melbourne, later moving to Maidstone, and the foundation of the whole program was a job lot of 26 surplus Oldsmobile blocks acquired from General Motors, brand new castings the company no longer wanted, at a reported cost of about £11 each. £11 for the foundation of a Grand Prix engine. Ferrari probably spent more than that on espresso in a race weekend. And to be clear, because this audience knows its history, these were not junkyard motors pulled out of wrecked sedans. They were unused factory castings, fresh from the foundry, that the mightiest car company on earth was happy to see the back of. 2 of the 26 became test prototypes. The rest went racing. Fact 3. It was designed by a motorcycle legend, largely in a London suburb. The man who turned a sedan block into a championship engine was Phil Irving, the Australian engineer already famous as the design brain behind the Vincent motorcycles, the machines that had spent the 40s and 50s terrorizing the world's speed records. Irving was not a committee man, and this was not a committee engine. Working from early 1964, much of it done in Clapham in London so he could be near Brabham's base, Irving kept the American bottom end and threw away almost everything else. he designed new single overhead cam cylinder heads with chain-driven cams, replacing the wheezing pushrod arrangement the sedans had used. He fitted cast iron liners into the aluminium block. He commissioned a forged flat-plane crankshaft in nitrided steel from Laystall in England and fed the engine through Lucas fuel injection. The old bolt holes were retapped for proper studs, and where the sedan block needed sealing, the valley plates went on with araldite. Glue, essentially. The finished 3-litre engine displaced just under 3,000 cubic centimetres and weighed only around 340 pounds, one of the lightest engines of the new formula. The men who were inside Repco at the time recall the original development budget as around £10,000. Their rivals were spending fortunes on clean sheet designs with 12 and 16 cylinders. Repco was modifying a cast-off with adhesive on the budget of a suburban house and about to beat all of them. Fact 4. The car was a leftover too. Here is the detail that makes this story almost absurd. The BT19 chassis was not designed for this engine at all. Ron Toranak, the quiet Australian engineer who was Brabham's design partner and the other half of everything the team built, had drawn it in 1965 around a Coventry Climax 16-cylinder engine that never raced, because Climax abandoned the project and walked away from Formula One entirely. So the BT19 was a one-off orphan, a simple, mild steel space frame with no engine and no future, sitting in the workshop while the rest of the sport moved to fashionable monocoques. When the Repco 5.8 arrived, Brabham and Toranak bolted the reject engine into the reject chassis and went racing. Toranak called the car the Old Nail because it was 2 years old, pleasant to drive, and had no vices. It was also light in a way its rivals could not touch. The new rules set a minimum weight of 500 kilograms, and the BT19 actually sat comfortably above that figure, which tells you how gross everything else was. At Monza, the scrutineers weighed the field, and the Brabham came in at around 1,219 pounds, while the BRM weighed over 1,500 and the Honda over 1,600. Some of the opposition were hauling 300 to 400 extra pounds around every single lap. The Old Nail did not need to be powerful. Everyone else had already lost the weight battle before the engines even fired. Fact 5. The rules doubled and every big team overreached at once. For 1966, Formula One doubled engine capacity from 1.5 litres to 3, and the press called it the return to power. Every major team responded with maximum ambition, and ambition destroyed all of them at once. Ferrari took a heavy V12 derived from its sports car program, down on torque and carrying endurance racing bulk, and then imploded politically. John Surtees, their reigning champion from 1964 and the fastest man in the team, won the Belgian Grand Prix in June and then walked out of Ferrari days later. After team management denied him the lead role at Le Mans in a power struggle he refused to lose. Ferrari's season died in that argument. BRM built the H16, an engine so baroque it was effectively 2 flat 8s stacked on top of each other. A masterpiece of complication that spent the year crushing its own chassis under its weight and shaking itself to pieces. Cooper dusted off a Maserati V12 whose design traced back to 1957. Lotus, abandoned by Climax, split its efforts between an undersized stopgap engine and a car built around that same BRM H16, which meant Lotus had voluntarily adopted someone else's biggest mistake. The Repco engine had quietly run its first laps in the non-championship South African Grand Prix on New Year's Day of 1966, a shakedown far from the European spotlight, so by the time the championship began, the discarded sedan block already had race miles in it, while half the paddock was still machining prototypes. The season opened at Monaco with Jackie Stewart winning for BRM in an enlarged version of their old engine, which told everyone the new 3-litre cars were not ready. They were about to find out whose would come good first. And here is the number that decides the season. The Italian engines claimed around 360 horsepower. The H16 and the Honda claimed as much as 400. The Repco gave 300 to 310, honestly measured, which on paper made the discarded American sedan engine the weakest thing on the grid. But the claimed figures were inflated and everyone in the paddock knew it. The heavy cars burned more fuel and punished their tyres, and the Repco started every morning and finished every afternoon. Across the whole of 1966, none of Brabham's rivals managed more than a handful of race finishes. Reliability was not a virtue that season, it was a superpower. Fact 6. At Reims, he made history nobody has ever repeated. The French Grand Prix, July 1966, on the ferociously fast public road circuit at Reims, where slipstreaming duels were settled at speeds that would frighten modern drivers. Jack Brabham won it, and in doing so became the first man in the history of the World Championship to win a Grand Prix in a car bearing his own name. Precision matters here, because two other men later matched the smaller version of this achievement. Dan Gurney won at Spa the following year in his own beautiful Eagle, and Bruce McLaren won in a McLaren in 1968. Winning a race in your own car is rare but not unique. What Brabham did next is unique. He kept winning until the entire championship belonged to a car with his name on it. And in the 60 years of Formula One since, through Ferrari and McLaren and Williams and every garage dreamer who ever painted his own name on a nose cone, no other driver has ever done it. The record has outlived Brabham himself, and there is no realistic path to anyone matching it now, because the age of a driver building his own car is gone forever. Fact 7. The beard, the cane, and the 40-year-old they called finished. By 1966, Brabham was 40, and the British press had spent 2 seasons writing him off as a relic, a grumpy old mechanic keeping a seat warm while the young lions of the sport waited their turn. His response came at Zandvoort before the Dutch Grand Prix, with the championship fight at full boil. Brabham appeared on the starting grid, hobbling like a pensioner, leaning on a cane, wearing a long, false beard, playing to perfection the ancient invalid the newspapers had described. Then he tossed the props aside, climbed into the old nail, and won the race. Asked afterwards whether it was extraordinary for a man of his age to be leading the World Championship, his reply was one word: why? If you saw my video on the tiny Cooper team that humiliated Ferrari, you already know Brabham was the man driving those Coopers to both of their world titles in 1959 and 1960. He had spent an entire career being underestimated by people with bigger budgets and louder engines. The beard at Zandvoort was simply the first time he told the joke in public. Fact 8. 4 straight wins, then a championship clinched from the pit lane. Brabham won the French, British, Dutch and German Grand Prix back-to-back, 4 consecutive victories spanning Reims, Brands Hatch, Zandvoort and the Nürburgring. The last of them around the most dangerous circuit on Earth, 14 miles of green hell where one mistake was usually the last. A reject engine in a reject chassis had now beaten the best of Italy, Britain and Japan 4 times in 5 weeks. Then came Monza in September and the strangest coronation in the history of the sport. Ferrari's home ground, 100,000 tifosi, and the one place on the calendar where raw power mattered most, and the little Repco gave away the most. Brabham's engine let go on lap 8 and sprayed its oil over the car, and he climbed out to watch the rest from the sidelines, which by rights should have been the day the fairy tale paused. His only remaining challenger for the title was Surtees, now driving a Cooper Maserati, and on lap 24, a split fuel tank ended his race. And so Jack Brabham became world champion of 1966, standing in the pit lane at Ferrari's home race in oil-stained overalls, while the Italian crowd roared for a Ferrari 1-2 that changed absolutely nothing. He finished the year with 42 points to Surtees' 28, and the constructors' title came with it. At 40 years and 5 months, he was the oldest champion since the great Fangio in 1957, and in all the years since, no champion has been older. Only Fangio and Farina ever won a title at a greater age. The car that carried him was a 2-year-old space frame designed for a dead engine, powered by a block Detroit had scrapped to save money, and it beat the most expensive engineering 3 continents could assemble. Fact 9. Then they did it again, just to prove it was not luck. Hume deserves his own moment here because he had spent 1966 as the perfect wingman, 3rd in France, 2nd to his boss at Brands Hatch, 3rd at Monza and Mexico, 4th in the championship in the sister car. The two of them had turned reliability into a team sport, and if 1966 had been a fluke, 1967 would have exposed it, because the big teams spent the winter fixing their mistakes. Instead, the Brabham Repco team came back and finished the job twice over. Denny Hume, Brabham's quiet, burly New Zealand teammate, a man so unglamorous the press barely knew what to do with him, won at Monaco and the Nürburgring and took the Drivers' Championship with 51 points. Brabham himself finished second on 46, winning in France and Canada, and the team collected a second consecutive Constructors' title. An Australian owner and a New Zealand driver, first and second in the World Championship. In cars from a team the European establishment had once dismissed as a glorified garage operation, Hume remains to this day the only New Zealander ever to win the Formula One World Championship. By then, Repco had moved beyond the original American castings. Only the earliest engines contained any Oldsmobile parts at all, and from 1967 the blocks were Repco's own design, cast in Australia and 30 pounds lighter than the General Motors original. The American engine had been the seed, not the crutch. Detroit provided the starting point, and a parts company from Melbourne did what General Motors would not, which was finish the thought. Fact 10. America threw the same engine away twice, and it kept winning for 40 years. Here is the ending Detroit never saw coming, because Repco was not the only outfit that found treasure in the cancelled aluminium V8. In 1964, a Rover executive visiting Mercury Marine in Wisconsin stumbled across one of the engines sitting on the floor, destined for a powerboat, and could not believe something that light was unwanted. Rover chased it, and in January 1965, General Motors sold them the tooling for the Buick version of the engine, even sending the retiring Buick engineer who knew it best across the Atlantic as a consultant. That block became the Rover V8. It went into production in 1967 and stayed there until 2004, 37 years and close to 1 million engines. Range Rovers, TVRs, Morgans, MGs, an entire British industry ran on the engine America did not want. So follow the ledger. General Motors designed a brilliant engine, built 750,000 of them, and abandoned the idea to save money. One branch of the family conquered Formula One in Australian hands and won back-to-back world championships. The other became the beating heart of the British motor industry for 4 decades. America kept the receipts, and everyone else kept the trophies. Jack Brabham was knighted in 1979, the first Formula One driver ever to receive the honour, decades before Moss, Stewart or Hamilton got theirs. The old nail survives in Australia as a national treasure. And somewhere in the archives of General Motors there is a 1963 memo explaining, in confident accounting language, why the aluminium V8 had no future. 60 years on, nobody has matched what that little team did, and it was all built on the one thing Detroit refused to believe, that clever beats expensive when the clever people are hungry enough. Tell me in the comments which car you want next, and tell me if I got anything wrong, because this audience always knows. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one.